The iron gate creaked as if lamenting the weight of an ancient secret. Across the silent street, the millionaire watched, disbelieving, his wife's bent figure before the neighbor's trash cans. Her light-colored dress, once a symbol of elegance, was stained with dust. Her trembling hands, plunged among remnants, searched for something with an almost childlike urgency. The sound of tearing plastic cut through the night's silence. Time seemed suspended. Before we delve into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you are joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Tuesday night fell upon the affluent neighborhood like a heavy cloak, laden with silence and secrets. Robert Miller adjusted the knot of his tie before the mirror of his black Jaguar, preparing for another business meeting that would extend into the late hours. At 52, he had built an empire that began with a small construction supply store and grew into one of the largest construction companies in the nation. Every brick of his fortune was laid with sweat, tears, and a determination that bordered on obsession. The engine purred softly as he drove through the tree-lined streets of the exclusive gated community where he had lived for 15 years. The houses rose like fortresses of glass and marble, each more imposing than the last, in a silent competition of status and power. Robert knew his neighbors only by sight. Polite greetings, smiles of convenience, superficial conversations about the weather or traffic. That's how he liked it. Too much closeness always seemed like a vulnerability to him. That night, however, something different caught his attention. A figure moved in the shadows of the house next door, near the waste containers that were discreetly hidden behind a wooden fence. Robert slowed down, frowning. The neighborhood had strict surveillance, and any suspicious movement was immediately reported. But that silhouette didn't seem threatening. It was small, delicate, almost ghostly in the yellowish light of the lamppost. He stopped the car across the street and watched. The figure bent over the trash cans with careful, almost reverent movements. There was something familiar in that gesture, in the way the hands moved, in the slope of the shoulders. Robert felt his heart quicken when the woman turned slightly and the lampost's light illuminated her profile. It was Clara, his wife. The air seemed to leave his lungs all at once. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, or that the pressure of work had finally affected his mind. But there was no doubt. It was her, with her brown hair always impeccably styled, now loose and disheveled. The light-colored dress he had seen her wear at dinner a few hours earlier, now stained with dust and dampness. Clara looked around nervously, like someone doing something forbidden. Her hands trembled slightly as they rummaged among plastic bags and discarded packaging. The sound of the material tearing echoed in the silent street, a noise that seemed amplified by Robert's disbelief. He wanted to get out of the car, shout, demand an explanation. But something held him in place, perhaps the shock, perhaps the fear of what he might discover. Instead, he stayed there, watching his wife of 20 years search for something among the remnants that others had discarded. The scene was so surreal that he blinked several times, hoping the vision would disappear like a mirage. Clara found what she was looking for, a plastic bag that she carefully examined before opening. Inside, Robert could see pieces of bread, still edible fruits, food scraps that seemed to have been carefully separated. She collected everything delicately, as if handling something precious, and placed it in a bag she carried with her. Her next movement completely gave her away. Clara glanced furtively to the sides, like someone afraid of being discovered, and walked quickly towards her own house's gate. Robert watched her disappear into the garden's shadows, leaving him alone with a reality his mind refused to process. He couldn't go to the meeting that night. He stood there for almost an hour, trying to understand what he had seen. Clara, the same woman who drank tea from French porcelain, who wore designer dresses, and frequented the city's most expensive beauty salons, was rummaging through trash in the dead of night. Questions multiplied in his mind like a storm. Why would she do that? Did she need money? Was she sick? Had she lost her mind? Or was it something worse? something he couldn't even imagine. When he finally arrived home, Robert found Clara in the living room, calmly reading a book. She was impeccable again, hairstyled, dressed clean, makeup retouched. For a moment he doubted what he had seen. Perhaps it was someone else, a stranger who merely resembled his wife. "How was the meeting?" she asked without lifting her eyes from the book. "It was cancelled," he lied, observing every feature of her face in search of some sign, some clue of what he had witnessed. Clara merely nodded and continued reading. Robert went up to the bedroom but couldn't sleep. He lay beside her, listening to her regular breathing, trying to reconcile the image of the elegant woman sleeping beside him with the bent figure he had seen rummaging through trash hours earlier. The next morning, he observed her during breakfast. Clara was normal. She talked about weekend plans, commented on newspaper news, asked about his business. Nothing in her behavior suggested that anything was wrong. Nevertheless, Robert couldn't get the image of her among the trash cans out of his mind. During the day, at the office, he found it difficult to concentrate. Contracts seemed blurred, meetings sounded distant. His secretary asked if he was feeling well, and Robert merely murmured an excuse about being tired. But he knew it wasn't tiredness. It was the weight of a secret he didn't know how to carry, the discovery that the person closest to him was, in fact, a stranger. That night, Robert decided he needed the truth. He arrived home earlier, invented an excuse about having forgotten some documents, and waited. If Clara returned to that place, if she repeated that bizarre ritual, he would be certain it hadn't been a product of his imagination. And she returned. Clara's second appearance by the trash cans destroyed any hope Robert had that the first had been a mistake. It was almost midnight when he saw her leave the house through the back door, walking through the garden shadows like a sleepwalker towards her clandestine destination. This time, Robert got out of the car. He needed to understand. He hid behind an old tree growing on the sidewalk, a few feet from where Clara performed her mysterious ritual. From there, he could hear every sound, observe every movement, capture every detail of the scene that tormented him. Clara arrived at the spot with the familiarity of someone who had repeated that path for a long time. She knew every shadow, every hiding place, every safe moment to act. First, she looked around carefully, checking if no one was watching. Her eyes passed over the place where Robert was hiding, but she didn't see him. What followed was even more disturbing than the first time. Clara wasn't just looking for food. She was following a pattern, an almost religious ritual. She first opened the right-hand container, examined its contents, selected a few items, and carefully placed them in her bag. Then she moved to the middle container, repeating the process. It was methodical, organized, as if she knew exactly what to look for. Robert noticed that she didn't take just anything. There was discernment in her choices. She separated pieces of bread that were still fresh, fruits with minor imperfections but still edible, packages containing remnants of homemade meals. It was as if she distinguished between common waste and something more valuable. What intrigued him most was the expression on her face. There was no despair, no shame. There was, instead, a kind of serene, almost meditative concentration. Clara seemed to be doing something she considered important, necessary, perhaps even sacred. As he watched, Robert tried to process what this meant. They had enough money to buy anything they wanted. Their home pantry was always stocked with the best products. Clara had unlimited credit cards, jewelry worth more than imported cars, a life of absolute material comfort. Why then was she there, in the dead of night, rummaging through remnants discarded by others? The answer came when Robert noticed something that had escaped his first observation. Clara wasn't just collecting. She was selecting with care, almost with love. Her hands touched each item as if it had value, as if it deserved respect. It was the gesture of someone who sees treasure where others see waste. When she finished, Clara carefully closed the containers, wiped her hands on a handkerchief she took from her pocket, and walked back home. Robert followed her at a distance, keeping to the shadows. She entered through the back of the house and disappeared into the kitchen. Robert waited a few minutes before entering. When he reached the kitchen, he found Clara washing her hands at the sink. The bag had disappeared. "You took a while today," she said, without turning around. "I had to sort out a few things at the office," he lied, watching her intently. Clara dried her hands and turned to him. Her face was serene, without any trace of guilt or nervousness. It was as if the last 30 minutes simply hadn't existed. "I'll make some tea. Do you want some?" Robert nodded, still trying to understand how she managed to maintain that normality. They sat in the living room, drinking tea in silence. Clara flipped through a home decor magazine, occasionally commenting on design trends or ideas for renovating the garden. It was a common domestic conversation, completely disconnected from the bizarre scene Robert had witnessed minutes earlier. In the following days, Robert began to observe his wife with new eyes. He looked for signs, clues, anything that would explain her nocturnal behavior. He noticed small details that had previously gone unnoticed. How Clara always knew when the garbage trucks passed through the neighborhood. How she showed excessive interest in neighbors' habits. How she sometimes seemed distant during meals, as if her thoughts were elsewhere. He also noticed that Clara had small daytime rituals that seemed connected to her nocturnal activities. She constantly checked the pantry, organized and reorganized food, separated meal leftovers in a way that seemed more discerning than usual. Robert began to confront a possibility that haunted him. Clara wasn't doing it out of material necessity. There was something deeper, something he didn't understand, something she perhaps couldn't even explain to herself. One night, he decided to follow her more closely. He wanted to know what she did with the items she collected. Could it be that she consumed them? The idea disgusted and terrified him at the same time. Clara left the house as usual, but this time Robert was prepared. He knew her route, knew how long she took, had mapped all her movements. When she reached the containers, he was already positioned in the ideal spot to observe. What he saw surprised him even more. Clara wasn't just collecting for herself. She separated the items into different categories, putting some in a bag and others in smaller packages she took from her coat. There was organization, method, purpose in every gesture. When she finished, instead of returning home, Clara walked in the opposite direction. Robert followed her, keeping to the shadows, trying to understand where she was going with her mysterious load. The discovery that followed would forever change the way he saw his wife, his life, and himself. Clara stopped in front of a small house at the end of the street, a modest building that contrasted with the mansions of the community. Robert recognized the place. It was the home of Sebastian, the widowed neighbor who had lived alone since his wife died almost a year ago. The man, in his early 70s, was discreet, rarely seen, and Robert had barely exchanged a few words with him in all those years. Clara opened the low gate with familiarity and walked to the front door. She didn't knock, didn't ring the doorbell. Instead, she carefully placed some of the packages she carried on the doorstep, arranged them with care, and returned the same way. Robert watched, confused. Clara still carried the main bag, but she had left part of her collection at Sebastian's door. It was as if she were making a delivery, fulfilling some kind of silent commitment. His wife didn't return home. Instead, she continued walking through the neighborhood streets, occasionally stopping in front of other houses. Robert followed her at a distance, witnessing something that challenged everything he thought he knew about her. At each stop, Clara left something. Sometimes it was food, sometimes it was small objects she had collected. She never left everything in the same place. She seemed to know the specific needs of each destination. In a house where a family with young children lived, she left fruits and bread. In another, where an elderly person lived, she left medications that were still within their expiration date. The realization hit Robert like a punch to the stomach. Clara wasn't collecting trash out of her own necessity. She was rescuing discarded items to redistribute them to people who might need them. It was a system of silent solidarity, a network of care that operated in the shadows of the night. When Clara finally returned home, Robert was waiting in the living room. He had arrived before her and pretended to be reading, but his hands trembled as he held the book. He needed answers, but he didn't know how to ask the questions without revealing that he had been spying on her. "Clara," he said when she entered the living room, "we need to talk." She stopped at the door, watching him. For a moment, Robert thought he saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but it might have just been a projection of his own anxiety. "About what?" "About you. About us, about the things you do when you think no one is watching." The silence that followed was dense, laden with tension. Clara sat in the armchair opposite him, clasped her hands in her lap, and waited. She didn't deny it, didn't pretend not to understand. It was as if she knew this moment would come, as if she were prepared for it. "How long have you known?" she asked finally. "A few days." "I saw you at Sebastian's house. I saw you taking things from the trash." Robert struggled to keep his voice controlled. "I don't understand, Clara. We have everything. Why would you do this?" Clara sighed deeply, as if preparing to reveal a secret she had kept for a long time. "Do you remember when Mrs. Mary, Sebastian's wife, died?" Robert nodded. It had been a significant event in the neighborhood. Mrs. Mary was known for her kindness, always willing to help neighbors, to care for those in need. After she died, Sebastian couldn't bring himself to throw away the foods she used to make. He would cook her recipes, but he couldn't eat them. Everything would just sit there, spoiling. But he didn't have the heart to discard it, because it was the only way to keep her memory alive. Robert frowned, trying to understand the connection. "One day, I saw him crying in the garden. I went to talk to him and found out what was happening. He was slowly killing himself, trapped in those memories. So I started to help. Help how? By collecting the food he left in the trash. At first, it was just so he wouldn't feel guilty about wasting it. But then I realized there were other people in the neighborhood who could benefit from it." Clara stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. "Do you know everyone's story here, Robert? Do you know that Mrs. Carmen from the Blue House survives on a minimal pension? That Mr. John lost his job and is struggling? That the Oliver family has 3 small children and the father is unemployed?" Robert realized he knew none of this. To him, neighbors were just figures who drove by or greeted politely. He had never been interested in their lives, their struggles, their needs. "So you redistribute, is that it?" "That's it," Clara turned to him. "I started small, just with Sebastian's food. But then I realized that everyone in this neighborhood throws away things that still have value. Food that's good, clothes that have barely been worn, objects that work perfectly. It's a cruel waste while there are people in need." Robert tried to process the information. His wife had created a network of nocturnal redistribution, collecting discards from some to meet the needs of others. It was altruism, but practiced in the shadows in secret. "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara laughed, but it wasn't a joyful laugh. "Because I knew what your reaction would be. The same one you're having now, shock, shame, incomprehension. To you, this is degrading. To me, it's necessary." She was right. Robert felt ashamed, confused, unable to comprehend how his wife could stoop to rummaging through trash when they had the resources to help in more dignified ways. "Clara, if you wanted to help these people, why didn't you just give them money? Why didn't you make donations through institutions? Why this whole charade?" The question came out more acrid than Robert intended, and he saw Clara recoil as if she'd been wounded. "Because it's not about the money, Robert. It's about not wasting. It's about recognizing value where others see discard. It's about doing it with dignity, without humiliating the recipient." "Dignity?" Robert stood up, his voice rising. "You call rummaging through trash in the dead of night dignity? I call it dignity to care for each other without fanfare, without expecting recognition, without turning charity into a spectacle." Clara's words hit Robert like arrows. He realized she was talking about him, about the way he viewed generosity. Always public, always recognized, always converted into self-benefit. Silence settled between them again. Robert sat down once more, trying to reorganize his thoughts. Clara returned to her armchair, but she didn't sit. She remained standing as if preparing to leave. "There's more you need to know," she said finally. "If we're going to have this conversation, we're going to have it completely." Robert looked at her, realizing he was about to discover that the last few days of revelations were just the tip of a much larger iceberg. In the weeks that followed the revelation, Robert began to observe Clara with an almost obsessive attention. Every gesture of hers gained new meaning. Every outing became a source of curiosity. He discovered that his wife's life was much more complex than he had imagined, full of activities and commitments she had never mentioned. One Thursday morning, Clara announced she was going out to meet a friend. Robert, who had cancelled his meetings to be able to follow her, saw her get into the car and drive towards the city centre. He followed her at a distance, curious to find out who this friend was and where they would meet. To his surprise, Clara didn't go to a cafe or a mall as he expected. Instead, she stopped in front of a modest nursing home on the city's outskirts. Robert parked across the street and watched his wife enter the building carrying a bag and a simple bouquet of flowers. He waited for almost 2 hours. When Clara finally came out, her face was transformed. There was a serenity, a fullness in her expression that Robert hadn't seen in a long time. It was as if she had just experienced a deeply significant moment. Robert decided to investigate. The next day, he returned to the nursing home and spoke with the receptionist, pretending to be interested in learning about services for an elderly relative. That's how he discovered that Clara had been volunteering there for over 3 years, weekly visiting the elderly residents who received no family visits. "Mrs. Clara is an angel," said the head nurse when Robert mentioned his wife's name. "She doesn't just visit, she knows each one's story, remembers birthdays, brings small gifts. Some of our residents consider her the family they never had." Robert left the nursing home stunned. 3 years. Clara had been doing that for 3 years, and he had never suspected. How was it possible that two people who slept in the same bed, who had coffee together every morning, who shared the same house for 2 decades, were practically strangers? In the following days, he discovered more. Clara not only visited the nursing home, she coordinated an informal network of support for needy elderly people. She used her own money to buy medicine, paid for medical consultations, organized small birthday parties. And she did all of this in absolute secrecy. Robert began to mentally review the last years of his marriage. How many times had Clara said she was going to meet a friend or sort some things out? How many times had he assumed she was at some beauty salon or making frivolous purchases? How many times had he mentally belittled her, considering her a spoiled and idle woman? Guilt began to corrode him from within. He realized he had never truly paid attention to Clara's life. To him, she was an accessory to his existence, beautiful, elegant, suitable for his social standing. But he had never been interested in her thoughts, her dreams, her deep motivations. One night, after discovering that Clara also maintained a secret bank account from which she withdrew money for her charitable activities, Robert decided to confront her again. "You have an entire life I don't know about," he said when she entered the house after one of her outings. Clara stopped at the living room door and watched him. Robert was sitting in the same armchair as always, but there was something different in his posture, in his expression. "It's true," she admitted. "I do. Why? Why did you hide all of this from me?" Clara sat in the armchair opposite him, the same setup as their previous conversation. But this time, there was a sadness in her eyes that Robert hadn't noticed before. "Because you never asked," she said simply. "In 20 years of marriage, you never showed genuine interest in what I did, what I thought, what moved me. To you, I was Robert Miller's wife, the woman who accompanied him to business dinners and took care of the house. I was never, Clara, the person. The words hit Robert like a slap. He tried to protest, but realized she was right. When was the last time he had asked about her dreams? When had he shown curiosity about her opinions, her fears, her desires? I thought we shared everything. We shared a house, a bed, a bank account, Clara replied. But we never shared lives. You live in your world of business and achievements. I lived in my world of solitude and search for purpose. Solitude. Robert frowned. But we were together every day. Clara smiled, but it was a sad smile. Robert, it's possible to be profoundly alone next to someone. It's possible to share the same house and live in completely different universes. They remained silent for a few minutes. Robert tried to process the idea that his wife had built an entire life parallel to his own, full of meaning and purpose, while he remained oblivious to it all. "And now?" he asked finally.
What happens now that I know?
Clara stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the street was silent, illuminated only by the lampposts. It was almost time for her nightly rounds. "Now you need to decide if you want to know who I really am," she said without turning around, "or if you prefer that I continue to be just Robert Miller's wife." Robert looked at his wife's back, at the delicate silhouette outlined against the window's light. For the first time in decades, he realized he was facing a woman he didn't know, a complex and fascinating person who had been by his side all this time, waiting to be seen. "I want to know," he said, and his voice came out almost as a whisper. Clara turned to him, and Robert saw tears in her eyes. "Then come with me," she said, extending her hand. "Tonight, you will see the world through my eyes." Robert hesitated for a moment. Leaving the house in the middle of the night to collect trash and engage in clandestine charity was something that went against everything he represented. But looking at Clara, truly looking at her, and seeing the hope in her eyes was enough to make him stand up. For the first time in 20 years, Robert Miller was about to truly know his wife. The night was cold when Robert and Clara left through the back of the house. He had never used that door, which led directly to the backyard garden, far from the majestic main entrance he always used. It was as if he were discovering secret corners of his own home. Clara carried 2 empty bags and a small flashlight. She wore dark, comfortable clothes, very different from the elegant dresses she wore during the day. Robert, awkward in his first experience as a night collector, had chosen a dark suit, imagining it would be appropriate for the occasion. "You can't go like that," Clara said, observing his clothes. "You look like you're going to a funeral." Robert looked at himself and realized the absurdity of the situation. He was treating it like another social event, concerned with appearance and the impression he would make. Clara disappeared inside the house and returned with some of his casual clothes, jeans and a simple shirt he rarely wore. "Now that's better," she said when he changed. "Remember, we are not thieves, we are not beggars. We are people caring for other people. Keep that in mind, and you will understand what we do." Their first stop was Sebastian's house. Clara approached the containers with familiarity, but this time she wasn't alone. Robert watched her carefully examine the contents, separating items that seemed usable. "Look at this," she said, showing him a container with remnants of a homemade meal. "Sebastian made stroganoff today. It was Mary's favorite dish. He always makes enough for 2 people, but eats alone. The rest ends up here." Robert observed the food. It was fresh, well prepared, with only a small portion consumed. It was a waste, but also a ritual of grief from a man who didn't know how to live without his companion. "And what do you do with this?" "The Oliver family has 3 small children. The father has been unemployed for 6 months. This stroganoff will be their dinner tomorrow." Clara continued her collection, and Robert began to understand the pattern. She didn't take just anything. There was discernment, care, respect, both for what she collected and for who would receive it. It was work that required intimate knowledge of each family's needs, each person's preferences. Their second stop was 3 houses down. Clara collected clothes that were still in good condition, toys that had barely been used, books that might interest someone. "The lady who lives here buys compulsively," Clara explained. "She acquires things she never uses and then gets rid of them when she gets tired of them. It's a criminal waste when so many people are in need." Robert began to see the neighborhood with different eyes. Each house had a story. Each container revealed the habits and neuroses of its residents. There were those who wasted food, those who discarded functional objects, those who threw away expensive medications just because they changed prescriptions. "How do you know all this?" Robert asked as they walked to the next stop. "By paying attention," Clara replied. "By observing, by talking, by genuinely being interested in people's lives. You'd be surprised how much you can learn about someone just by observing what they throw away." Their third stop was revealing. It was the house of a family Robert knew by sight. They frequented the same social events, moved in the same circles. Clara collected an impressive amount of still edible food. "They have parties every week," she explained. "They buy absurd amounts of food, serve an elaborate buffet, and then throw everything away. A single one of their parties could feed an entire family for a month." Robert felt uncomfortable. He and Clara also threw parties, also wasted food, also discarded things that could be useful to others. The difference was that he had never thought about the fate of those discards. As the night progressed, Robert began to understand the scale of Clara's operation. She had mapped the entire neighborhood, knew the habits of each resident, knew when and where to find the best treasures. More importantly, she knew the specific needs of each beneficiary of her informal network. "Now comes the most important part," Clara said when they finished collecting. "The redistribution." They walked to an older part of the neighborhood where the houses were smaller and simpler. Clara stopped in front of the first house and took out some of the items she had collected from her bag. "Mrs. Carmen lives alone," she explained in a low voice. "She has diabetes and difficulty cooking. I always leave ready-made items that she can heat up and eat." Clara carefully arranged the food on the doorstep, covering it with a clean cloth to protect it from the morning's dampness. It was a delicate, respectful gesture that preserved the dignity of the recipient. At the next house, she left children's clothes and toys. Robert noticed that she folded each piece with care, organized the toys as if setting up a small display. "They have 3 small children," Clara whispered. "The father lost his job in construction. The mother works as a housekeeper, but the money barely covers rent and basic food." Robert observed the small house, the simple windows, the poorly kept garden. It was a world completely different from his own, but it was only a few blocks away. How had he lived so long without realizing there were people in difficulty so close to his own home? The last stop of the night was the one that impacted Robert the most. Clara stopped in front of a small ground-floor apartment where an elderly man lived, whom he occasionally saw walking in the morning. "Mr. John," Clara said. "Retired, widowed, no close family. Sometimes he goes days without talking to anyone." Instead of just leaving items at the door, Clara knocked gently. After a few minutes, a white-haired man opened the door. His face lit up when he saw Clara. "My dear, so good to see you." "I brought some things for you," Clara said, showing a bag with food and a small radio that had been discarded but still worked perfectly. "You're an angel," the man said, and Robert could see tears in his eyes. "I don't know what I'd do without your kindness." Robert remained a little distant, observing the interaction. There was genuine love there, a deep human connection between two people who cared for each other. Clara wasn't just providing material items, she was offering dignity, respect, companionship. When they finally returned home, Robert was silent. His mind tried to process everything he had seen and experienced in those few hours. The world had revealed itself to be much more complex and interconnected than he had imagined. "So," Clara asked when they reached the living room, "what do you think?" Robert sat heavily in the armchair. He felt exhausted, not physically but emotionally. It was as if he had traveled to a foreign country where the rules and values were completely different from his own. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I didn't know there was so much need so close to us. I didn't know it was possible to help in this way." Clara sat opposite him as in their previous conversations. But this time, there was something different in the atmosphere. It was as if a barrier had been removed, as if they were finally speaking the same language. "Now, do you understand why I do this?" Robert nodded. He was beginning to understand that Clara had found a purpose, a way to give meaning to her life through caring for others. It was something that transcended charity. It was a philosophy of life, a way of seeing the world where nothing had value merely for its price, but for its capacity to serve and help. "But I still don't understand why you hid this from me all these years." Clara sighed deeply. "Because I knew you wouldn't understand. Because your way of helping is writing checks, making public donations, receiving plaques of appreciation. I needed something more intimate, more real." Robert realized she was right. All his charitable contributions were calculated, aiming for image returns and tax benefits. He had never helped anyone without expecting something in return. And now, he asked, "What happens now?" Clara watched him for a long time, as if trying to read something on his face. "Now you decide if you want to be a part of this or if you prefer to pretend you never saw anything." The choice was made even before Robert thought about it. For the first time in his life, he had found something that seemed more important than money, more valuable than professional success. "I want to be a part of it," he said. Clara smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Robert had seen on her face in a long time. "Then prepare yourself," she said, "because you are about to discover that the life you know is just a small part of what exists out there." The months that followed transformed Robert in a way he had never imagined possible. The man who once woke up thinking about contracts and profits now planned his nights according to the needs of his neighbors. The executive who considered time too precious a currency to be wasted began dedicating hours to conversations with lonely elderly people and playing with needy children. But the transformation was neither easy nor immediate. Robert discovered that truly helping required skills he didn't possess: patience, humility, the ability to listen without judging. His first attempt to talk with Mr. John was a disaster. He arrived with the demeanor of a successful businessman trying to solve problems, offering practical solutions to issues that were not technical problems, but wounds of the soul. "You are trying to fix people as if they were broken machines," Clara observed after a particularly frustrating night. "They don't need to be fixed. They need to be seen, heard, respected." Robert had to relearn how to relate to people. He discovered that Mrs. Carmen didn't want him to pay her medical bills. She wanted someone to talk about the plants in her small garden, that the Oliver family didn't just need food, but hope. Someone who believed their situation could improve. The greatest revelation came when Robert realized that Clara had been his teacher all those years, even without him knowing. All the small kindnesses she showed in her daily life, her patience with employees, her delicacy in dealing with suppliers, her ability to remember birthdays and important dates, were signs of a philosophy of life that he had completely ignored. One night, while organizing the collected items in the garage that Clara had transformed into an improvised sorting center, Robert made a discovery that left him speechless. Hidden in a box, he found dozens of thank you cards and letters. They were messages from people Clara had helped over the years, elderly individuals who considered her a daughter, families who saw her as a guardian angel, children who drew her image as a symbol of kindness. "Why did you never show me this?" he asked, flipping through the letters with tear-filled eyes. "Because it wasn't for you," Clara replied simply. "It was for me. It was my way of knowing that my life had meaning." Robert then understood that Clara didn't do it for recognition or gratitude. She did it because she had found in every gesture of help a way to connect with something greater than herself. It was a spiritual need, a way to give purpose to an existence that otherwise would be just a succession of empty days in a luxurious house. As time passed, Robert began to notice changes in himself that went beyond his nocturnal activities. At the office, he started paying more attention to employees, asking about their families, their problems, their aspirations. He discovered stories of overcoming and hardship that existed right under his nose, but which he had never been interested in knowing. He also modified the company's policy. He implemented employee assistance programs, created an emergency fund for cases of illness or unemployment, established partnerships with local organizations to amplify the impact of his charitable actions. But he did all of this discreetly, without public fanfare, following Clara's example. The true test of his transformation came on a rainy winter night. Robert was returning from a work meeting when he saw a street child sheltered under an awning. A few months earlier, he would have driven straight past, perhaps feeling a momentary discomfort but without acting. This time, he stopped the car. The child, a boy perhaps 12 years old, was drenched and trembling with cold. Robert took off his coat and offered it to the boy, then took him to a nearby restaurant for a warm meal. During their conversation, he discovered that the boy had run away from home after his mother's death. Refusing to live with a violent stepfather, Robert didn't try to resolve the situation immediately, didn't offer money or quick solutions. Instead, he listened to the boy's story, respected his pain, offered support without judgment. It was Clara who, in the following days, helped connect the boy with competent social workers and a welcoming foster family. "You've learned," Clara said that night, watching Robert recount his encounter with the boy. "You've learned that helping isn't about solving problems quickly. It's about being present, being human." Robert nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had begun to understand that his transformation was just the beginning of something greater. Clara had opened a door to a world that had always existed, but which he had chosen to ignore. Now that he had seen the truth, he could no longer return to his former ignorance. That same night, he made a decision that would forever change the course of his life. For years, he had accumulated wealth, thinking it would give him security and happiness. Now he realized that true security came from genuine human connections, and true happiness was born from the ability to make a difference in the lives of others. "Clara," he said when they finished their nightly rounds, "I want to do more. More how? I want to transform all of this into something bigger. I want to create an organization that officially does what you do informally. I want to use our resources to amplify this work." Clara watched him for a long time, and Robert saw a mixture of pride and apprehension in her eyes. "Are you sure? This would mean letting go of control, sharing the spotlight, working with people who might not understand our philosophy." "I'm sure," Robert replied, "but I want to do it the right way, your way. No publicity, no search for recognition. Just doing what needs to be done." Clara smiled, and Robert knew he had found not only a new way of living, but a true partner for this journey. In the following months, they established the Extended Hands Foundation. The organization operated discreetly, focusing on the redistribution of wasted resources and direct support to families in need. Robert invested a large part of his fortune in the project, but insisted that Clara be the president and guiding force of the institution. The foundation grew organically, attracting volunteers who shared the same philosophy of discreet and respectful help. They developed a network that extended throughout the city, connecting wasted abundance with real needs. Robert discovered that donating his wealth didn't impoverish him. On the contrary, it enriched him in ways he had never imagined. Every family helped, every elderly person cared for, every child fed represented an investment in his own humanity. One night, almost a year after his first nocturnal expedition with Clara, Robert found himself alone in the living room, waiting for her to return from a visit to the nursing home. He looked around the luxurious house and realized it no longer gave him the same pleasure. What truly moved him now were the thank you letters arriving at the foundation, the stories of transformation they witnessed, the certainty that they were making a real difference in people's lives. When Clara arrived, she found him contemplative. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "I was thinking that you saved me," Robert replied. "I didn't know it, but I was drowning in a meaningless life. You showed me how to breathe again." Clara approached and held his hand. "We saved each other," she said. "I was drowning too, Robert. I was drowning in loneliness, in the feeling that my life didn't matter to anyone. You gave me a partner for this journey." They remained silent for a few minutes, looking out the window at the street where it had all begun. Outside, other foundation volunteers continued the work that Clara had started alone so many years before. "You know what's funny?" Robert said finally. "What?" I spent my whole life thinking that success was accumulating things. I discovered that success is being able to give them to those who need them." Clara smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. "And I spent my whole life thinking I had to do everything alone. I discovered that some missions are too big for just one person." That night, they went out together for another round. But now, they were no longer just a couple helping neighbors. They were leaders of a movement that was transforming the way an entire community viewed solidarity and waste. When they returned home in the early morning, Robert looked one last time at the silent street where Clara had been discovered rummaging through trash. He smiled as he realized that scene, which had initially shocked and confused him, had been the beginning of the greatest adventure of his life. The woman he thought was lost among the remnants discarded by others had, in fact, found the path to a life full of meaning. And by following her, Robert had discovered that true treasure was not in what we accumulate, but in what we are capable of sharing. In the final scene, Robert walks through the garden at dawn. The wind rustles the leaves, and the distant sound of a bell mixes with his held breath. He holds a loaf of bread in his hands, breaks it in two, and leaves it on the wall where birds land. The gesture is simple, but for the first time he understands what it means to share, not what's left over, but what still has value. The sun rises slowly, painting the sky in golden hues. Robert watches a family of birds approach the bread, each taking only what it needs, leaving the rest for the others. It's a simple lesson from a nature that never wastes, that always finds balance. Clara appears at the back door, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She approaches Robert and offers him one. They stand side by side, watching the day break over a world they now see with completely different eyes. "Ready for another day?" she asks. Robert smiles, taking a sip of the warm coffee. "Ready for another life," he replies. And as the sun rises completely on the horizon, illuminating not only their faces, but also the path ahead, Robert understands that some of life's greatest discoveries happen when we stop looking for treasures and begin to realize that we ourselves can be the treasure someone is needing to find. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.